Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
If it does, that's what you do.
Hi, and thank you for joining us on Ethical Perspectives. I am Beth Parker. I'm your host. As moderators, we invite a variety of panelists so that we can offer our viewing audience a variety of perspectives. I'm referring to my notes here. And we did invite our Congresswoman, Ashley Hinson, to this episode. Our topic is executive privilege. So let's meet our panelists. I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about why this topic is critical or of interest.
Hi, my name is Andy Grewal. I'm a professor at the University of Iowa Law School, and as someone who studies constitutional law, issues related to the president's authority or a former president's authority to prevent Congress from securing information is of obvious academic and national interest.
And hello, I'm Peggy Stover, Associate Professor of Practice and Director at the Tippie College of Business at the University of Iowa. And my interest in this topic really centers around specifically the events that took place in January 6th and also with the prior administration. So eager to have a good discussion about executive privilege.
I thank you both for being here. Both of you are veterans of ethical perspective. Let's dig right in. Despite her many evolutions, I'll call democracy, has pursued or at least voiced equal opportunity for all and integrity and balance in governance. Yet in recent times, we hear of challenges to the institution of democracy as we, the collective living generation, know her. For example, we have witnessed gutting Voting Rights Act, leveraged redistricting with a capital R, corporate media influence, and the destruction of the fragile strings of justice and law, as in brutalization of those cooperative behaviors and procedures that precede the generational flow of democratic evolution, such as peaceful transfer of power and obedience to subpoenas. The executive branch of government is one of three pillars seared into the democratic conscience of our founding fathers as an essential component. So in this episode, we will focus on the meaning and the impact of executive privilege as a tool of democracy and an element of governmental balance. So the concept of executive privilege has its origins, the origins like the separation of power is specifically credited to the Frenchman, I think Montesquieu, I'm pronouncing his name, in the Enlightenment. Under this influence, it was implemented in 1787 in the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States established America's national government and fundamental laws and guaranteed certain basic rights for its citizens. It was signed on September 17th of 1787 by delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Under America's first governing document, the Articles of Confederation, the national government was weak and states operated like independent countries. At the 1787 convention, delegates devised a plan for a stronger federal government with three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, along with a system of checks and balances to ensure no single branch would have too much power. So to start off our discussion, can we agree on a working definition of the separation of powers as the dual function of limiting the exercise of power within each branch, yet ensuring independent exercise of that power?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the core foundations of our government in the United States.
Okay. And you know, as I was doing research, I learned that executive privilege is implicit. It's not absolute. It's never conclusively articulated.
Yeah.
It was quite a surprise to me. The Constitution contains no provisions explicitly declaring that the powers of the three branches shall be separated. Comments about that? Comments about what that implies, what that means?
In the context of executive privilege, it is certainly the case that if you looked at the Constitution, you would not see an executive privilege clause, which I think might lend some skepticism to the topic. On the other hand, when we think about Congress's power, There's also no articulated power for Congress to issue subpoenas. So when we see the branches clashing like this, Congress versus the president, or a Congress versus a former president, each is a little bit in uncharted territory with respect to the source of their authority to subpoena and the authority to defend by invoking executive privilege.
Yeah. And I think executive privilege really came to light in the United States, at least most recently during the Nixon era, when, during the Watergate hearings, that's one of the things that Nixon tried to invoke was executive privilege as it pertains to the Watergate tapes and the information that, as we, have come to find out, pretty much hampered his administration, because of the fact that, it showed that even though he tried to hide behind executive privilege, his hands, were all over the place in terms of the scandal that ultimately led to, his departure from the White House. So.
It may be helpful for viewers to understand a common definition of executive privilege. Most broadly speaking, executive privilege could refer to any time a president refuses to disclose documents to Congress or others. More typically, in current political debates, and in the Nixon context as well, executive privilege is referring to protections of communications between the president and his closest advisors. The general idea is that for a president to do his or her job, it is critical that the president can freely ask questions. Otherwise, if anytime a president asked, should I bomb this country, for example, he might be reluctant to do so for fear that these open-ended inquiries would make it into the public space.
Yeah. And that brings up a really good point, Andy, in that, while the president definitely, should have some leeway in having private conversations with advisors in terms of just seeking some counsel about matters of state and, to your point, issues. It does, however, there where things I think can get a little dicey is the actions that the president is taking in terms of whether or not they are ethical. As I tell my students, just because something is legal doesn't make it right. So, in the case of Nixon, he tried to invoke executive privilege to try to prevent the release of communication that he had as it pertains to the break-in into the Watergate building.
Yeah, and I think courts have recognized this in the sense that executive privilege, whatever it means, isn't absolute. So recognizing Nixon's executive privilege, the Supreme Court found that the prosecutorial system and principles of due process were so critical that even though Nixon did have executive privilege over his conversations with his close advisors, that privilege must yield in some context.
Yeah. Yeah, in most recent history, or in most recent times, Obama and President Bush have invoked executive privilege in some of the issues that they've had to tackle under their respective administration.
I think the word you used, Peggy, was dicey.
Yeah.
I again, in my research, I was. It sounds like a free-for-all because subsequent presidents have used executive privilege. I have a short list here. In 1796, George Washington refused to comply with a request for documents by the House of Representatives that was related to treaties with Great Britain. 1833, Andrew Jackson cited executive privilege concerning documents related to removed federal deposits from the Second Bank of the United States. 1954, during the McCarthy hearings, Eisenhower used the claim of executive privilege to forbid provision of data about internal conversations, meetings, or written communications among staffers, with no exceptions. 1982, Peggy, as you mentioned, or we were talking more about Nixon, but in 1982, Reagan, regarding congressional requests for information, apparently said if Congress seeks information potentially subject to executive privilege, the executive branch officials should request the congressional body to hold its request in abeyance until the president decides whether to invoke the privilege. Okay, in '98,
Yeah.
Clinton invoked ethical perspectives, invoked executive privilege on 14 occasions, and later George W. invoked executive privilege on 6 occasions. Peggy, as you mentioned, 2012, Obama asserted executive privilege related to withholding Department of Justice documents. So why all the excitement now?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think all the excitement really has to center with the events that led up to the January 6th insurrection that took place at the U.S. Capitol. Trying to find out, who knew what and when, and how did this crowd, who were the key players that incited this crowd to basically, for lack of better words, came very close to overthrowing the U.S. government.
Yeah, I think part of it is just everything Trump related tended to ignite public interest, whether it's related to executive privilege or emoluments clause or immigration and so on. So I think executive privilege, as Beth pointed out, has been part of many major controversies over our nation's history. And I don't know that this one is the highest stakes. Nixon was also very high stakes, as was George Washington's stand down with Congress. But certainly in our media environment and after the Capitol riot, there ceased to be a lot of public attention paid to this specific legal issue.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is because it was taking place in real time. If you take a look at the last major event that really captured the nation's attention around executive privilege, that was, the Nixon era. And in that place and time, we did not have the internet. We did not have social media where people were live streaming 24/7 the ongoings of what was going on. Whereas what happened in January 6th, it was front and center for the entire world to see. And you had not only traditional media covering the event, but then you also had individuals who were there live streaming what was going on. So it really, I think, captured the attention of the of the world and the American public with what was going on.
Yeah, to your point, what about the precedent? Does it have anything to do with the fact that we have a former president claiming executive privilege? I don't recall excuse me, I don't recall seeing that referenced anywhere in any of my research, but obviously there's a lot I could have missed. What is the significance of this being related to a former president claiming executive privilege?
Yeah, there's some uncharted territory here. With respect to President Nixon, he went to the Supreme Court twice, once with respect to the Watergate tapes, but after leaving office, he sought to prevent disclosure of some of the documents and materials still held by the government. And an issue that the Supreme Court had to decide is, well, once you leave office, you, a former president, can you claim executive privilege? And the Supreme Court fairly nebulously said yes, because if the idea behind the privilege is to let a president speak openly with his or her advisors, it would be a bit weird if the privilege simply disappeared upon leaving office. So any president could be concerned, great, while I'm president, I don't have to worry about anyone knowing what I confide in my closest advisors. But if all of that suddenly becomes public on the next inauguration day for the next president, you can see why a president might be hesitant to be open, knowing that once he or she leaves office, everyone will know what happened in those very sensitive communications.
So you mentioned precedents. My question is, pulling from our earlier discussion, if executive privilege is never articulated, explicitly articulated, and then we have this whole new incident of a former president, that makes the slope even slippier. Slippier? More slippery?
Slippery. Yeah.
You slide a lot farther, but it just seems so the opposite of absolute to me, just intangible. where do we find accountability? How will we hold, how will we begin to define these areas so that we do have some solid ground to talk about? And you're reading my thoughts. Go ahead.
That's a difficult issue because, again, one view of the executive privilege is that it exists to serve the national interest. And if you take that view, we have one president at a time and only one president. So in the current political context, the only person who can properly claim executive privilege would be President Joe Biden. On the other hand, for the reasons I just mentioned about protecting former presidents and ensuring open conversations, arguably, and this is what courts are going to sort out right now, in fact, there were oral arguments on the issue today, is perhaps a privilege, a little bit of it is kept with the former president when he leaves office. And the question then becomes, well, how do you balance whatever interest a former president has over some communications with the current president's responsibility to act in the national interest? And ultimately, it's a question of who decides. Beth pointed to some difficult issues about ensuring accountability. One question would be, or one potential approach is for the courts to decide. And that's what they're being asked to do right now. But the courts may very well say, this is not for us to decide. Instead, the current president must decide whether compromising the former president's confidentiality serves the public interest, and we're just not going to get involved. So I think everybody agrees that there has to be some balancing here, but we don't know who should do the balancing, president and the president alone, or should the courts referee a dispute between a foreign president and a current governmental body?
Yeah. Then, the other thing to also, I think, to, keep in mind is in terms of the topics, what should be kept, confidential versus what should be disclosed. Is it issues that are of matter of national or foreign, national security, foreign matters? Is it, there's a lot of gray area here. I mean, if you have a former president, well, since we're talking about Trump here for a moment, if you have a president who was to some degree, whatever you want to define that, involved in this insurrection, doesn't the American public have a right to know, well, what exactly was his involvement and who from his inner circle was involved? So on the other hand, executive privilege, maybe he might invoke it by matters of foreign security, communications he had regarding with his advisors about a foreign country or a foreign issue that he was negotiating, treaties and what have you. So a lot of gray area here.
Yeah, and I think on those points, you can see why these issues take a while to resolve. The Watergate controversy involved with millions of pages of documents. And the rule isn't that whatever a president says to his advisors is privileged. It's more what a president says to his advisors in his official capacity or that relate to his official duties would be privileged. And a president could have lots of communications about lots of different things. It could be about his favorite reality TV show. Well, that's not privileged. It could be about whether to drop a bomb, how to respond to a congressional request. And at some point, somebody has to decide when there's a congressional information request, what information is or is not privileged. Well, how do you do that? It takes a while. Maybe a judge will have to sit in chambers and review document by document. And that's why these controversies don't lend themselves to easy judicial resolution.
Yeah.
So, Andy, I got a question for you because you kind of guided me away from the whole national security issue. Was that because of the scope of this conversation? Do you remember your suggestions, which I appreciate and took wholeheartedly? You want to talk about that a little bit? Because Peggy mentioned national security.
Oh, well, I suppose national security certainly does relate to executive privilege because the topic of these official communications may very well relate to sensitive issues of national security, CIA operations, and so on. I was expressed a little bit concerned about digging into national security writ large, war on terror, and so on. It was just in that context that I wanted to stay focused on the executive privilege.
Okay, thank you. So where does that leave us? What actions as lay people can we take to maintain the integrity and balance of our democratic system?
Peggy, you want to?
Yeah, well, definitely one of the things that we need to do as, just, as the public citizen, as the public, is we really need to hold our leaders accountable for their actions. And while there are definitely, like I said, there is, a lot of things that the public are not going to be, in the know, because again, going back to security issues, things that are going to be impacting the day-to-day running of the U.S. government. I think those are the things that the public should have an interest in, and to make sure that if democracy is going to be attacked, that the public has the right to know who the players are, what happened, and to do a thorough investigation to really get to the bottom line of, what drove things to get to the point that we are now. Okay.
Yeah, and I think how do you ensure ethical behavior among elected officials has been an issue since the country began, and of course, an issue for other democracies in other countries across the globe. I tend to think that the best way to ensure ethical government is to elect and appoint ethical people. Rules and conduct codes can do only so much. So as a citizen taking an interest in the political issues, any public policy issues of concern, being informed and voting consistent with your informed understanding is probably the best thing you can do. There's only so much the average Joe or average Jane can do about executive privilege, but at the ballot box, voting for people who you believe will discharge their duties faithfully and honorably would be the best way to ensure a faithful and honorable government.
I always thought that I have family members who work in the government as civilians, and they have to undergo a thorough background investigation and research in order to get certain security clearances. And it always stumps me that elected politicians are not held to that same standards, in that when we elect politicians, there is no such thing as doing a background check to make sure that they are eligible for security clearances. And I was recently attended a forum where the guest speaker said if politicians were held to the same standard as civilians who want to work for the U.S. government and need to get security clearance, most of them would fail.
Well, I mean, that's the nature of democracy. If the people want a scoundrel, they can have a scoundrel.
Yeah.
We could have a different system in which instead of the Constitution saying you have to be 35 years old, you have to pass various purity tests. You could do it, but that's not our American model.
Yeah.
The people get to decide who they want in office.
Yeah.
So do we have hope for our democracy? Where are we at? A lot of people are concerned. We hear threats to our democracy. Threats to our democracy. Are we at that critical juncture? Is it something we need to be looking at?
I would guess that in every decade of the last 200 years, there has been concerns about our democracy eroding. And of course, sometimes it has come very close. The Civil War, the nation was nearly ripped apart. As to whether someone feels our democracy is under attack today, I think that's up to any individual. I personally do not. I think we have a lot of resilience in our institutions, and as an immigrant family, I think we have the worst government except for every other one out there. So I'm optimistic, but I understand that others have different backgrounds and are more concerned.
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think our democracy is strong. I think it's taken some bruising the last few years, but I still hold out hope that the American people will, at the end of the day, do what is right in order to save what has made this country special, and that is really, the basis of democracy, and making sure that it just continues for well into the future. I mean, the U.S. has always been the role model for other countries to follow. Let's make sure that we continue that.
So we're kind of running out of time, but I'm going to see if I can sneak in one more question in this discussion, Peggy, based on your last comment. So then talking about the things introduced initially about gutting the Voting Rights Act and leveraging redistricting with a capital R and destruction of some of the things that we've seen. Talk more about that and your cautious optimism and Andy, your thorough optimism, which I'm glad to hear, and kind of wrap that include that maybe in some closing remarks as we draw to the end of our program here.
Sure. I think we're seeing a lot of changes taking place in the United States demographically, and I think a lot of it is what's driving this fear of certain individuals to try to hold on to power, realizing that change is coming, it's inevitable, you cannot stop it. And human beings do not like change. That's just built into our, DNA. We like things to stay very status quo. Unfortunately, the United States is undergoing tremendous changes in terms of demographics, and that is scaring a lot of people because of the unknown. And what you're seeing, and that is really driving a lot of these voter suppression laws that you're seeing throughout the country, along with other things that are taking place.
Demographics and also our position in the world.
Yeah.
I'm not sure Andy or Peggy, but it's right up front. We see it. We're going this in real time. I'm sorry, Andy, go ahead, please.
Oh, well, I think we should also credit the work of prior civil rights leaders and notice how far we have become. There were Black registration rates in various places, large swaths of the South, of less than 10%. Literacy tests were imposed. Real major voter suppression efforts. Now, in various of those jurisdictions, you have Black mayors or even governors when it was inconceivable 70 years ago. So there's always more work to do, and we should make sure that we don't go backwards. We should always work to make the country stronger because it's not perfect. But I think we should also look back at the achievements that so many fought hard for and the results they got.
Absolutely.
Andy, I love your optimism. Peggy, I love your realism. And I want to thank you both for joining us on Ethical Perspectives, and we'll have to come back and talk again. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.